Combat is a core part of the majority of games. It's what makes games an interactive medium. Experimenting and trying new strategies is what makes games replayable. I find that most games without combat generally don't have replay value. With the majority of games featuring combat of some kind, you'll see a lot of ideas repeated or even directly copied. But a rare few games had ideas that had never been done before and changed their combat into something you could only get from them. In this video, I want to take a look at the games that rethought stereotypical combat and made an experience that was wholly unique in their genre. Now, these first two games might not seem all that unique, but that's because they're the two oldest games in this video and have become hugely influential over the decades. Or we've become completely desensitized to the combat despite how it's only gotten objectively more impressive over time. Let's start with the former and discuss BanjoKazooie. Now, we generally don't think about combat when we think BanjoKazooie. Like with most 3D platformers, we think about the platforming and the challenges. But in the early days of 3D gaming, developers didn't know what to do with this new dimension and simply sought to recreate 2D games. This is why a lot of 3D games feel so antiquated, and the ones we remember are the ones that pioneered gaming into the future. In the platforming genre, this meant that enemies were defeated by jumping on them. After all, there was no other way that had been presented for platformer combat at the time. Unless you consider Metroid and Castlevania platformers, as this was before their amalgamated genre was dubbed the Metroidvania. Mario 64 hadn't perfected combat at all. I doubt you even remember or realize there's a punch button in Mario 64. That's how irrelevant that mechanic has become. And Crash Bandicoot simply took the idea of Sonic Spin and had a button for invulnerability. These games were still seeking to replicate the 2D genre instead of creating their own ideas for combat. Enemies were treated as obstacles. This is why they all go down in one hit. The game treats them no different from a spike pit. BanjoKazooie decided to treat its enemies and bosses with combat and strategy. It did this through Banjo's insane arsenal of moves, many of which were dedicated solely to dealing damage. It wasn't deep by any means, but it opened so many doors. Enemies weren't just obstacles to run past anymore, they were adversaries to overcome. This meant BanjoKazooie could have boss fights that didn't consist of dodging and then jumping on opponents. Not only did BanjoKazooie have an entire moveset for its protagonist, but rather than something stereotypical, they decided to make every move happen through a bird. They push what Kazooie can do to the limit, from basic pecking to an egg gun and an invincibility dash. It shows that from the earliest stages of design, they decided to make combat a much more expanded feature than it had previously been in platformers. And with the success of BanjoKazooie, other developers began to imitate them by expanding beyond jumping and spinning for attacks. Ratchet & Clank's wacky guns, Psychonauts' telepathic powers, and even Mario just made Kazooie into a hose and called it Flood. Now we don't blink twice when a 3D platformer has deep combat, and it's all thanks to BanjoKazooie. Next up, I want to talk about Pokemon. Good old, stale, repetitive, unoriginal Pokemon. Or that's the narrative you generally believe, but because of Pokemon's rampant success, we've just grown dull to how fantastic this franchise is. What I want you to imagine is that you're playing a Final Fantasy game. Now I want you to imagine that there are 1,000 possible party members, each with unique designs, moves, abilities, and stats, where no two are similar. Now I want you to imagine porting all 1,000 of those party members to a new system in under 2 years, all while designing 100 more and making an entirely new game for them to be put in. Dexit doesn't seem like such a realistic demand anymore, does it? Pokemon's current state is Game Freak's fault, because they release too many games for a franchise that's more ambitious than most JRPGs. Seriously, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are bigger RPGs than most Dragon Quest games. In terms of depth and quality, there's just so much more to do. So trying to get out one game a year is completely unrealistic, and that's why these games are held together with string. You want to know why, despite being the most successful media franchise of all time, there's hardly any competitors for Pokemon? Because they're a nightmare to make, just from the scale alone. An RPG where every single NPC is playable? You'd lose your mind if that were announced for any other franchise, and Pokemon does it on the regular. I know that's ranty, but I see such toxicity towards Game Freak, and while yes, the current state of Pokemon is entirely their fault, it's not because they're lazy, but overly ambitious. But I covered all the main points I needed to. Pokemon had a ridiculous idea for an RPG, where everyone is playable, and actually achieved it, and they continued to build on their vision until they had an industry giant on their hands. Sticking with Nintendo, let's talk about how they developed their own shooter with Splatoon. Nintendo needed an online shooter to compete in the market with Xbox and PlayStation, and since no Russian isn't their style, they came up with Splatoon instead. First of all, the concept is genius on its own. We can't have a shooter with real guns, so let's use the kid-friendly version of guns and use paintball. And they went so far with this idea, it's unbelievable. There's almost no end to the paint and gun-related weapons. The word splatling gun deserves an award on its own. The variety of styles is just the beginning. The de-emphasis on killing makes Splatoon appeal to parents and kids even more. It makes it so even if you're just learning, you're still helping because at least you're shooting at the ground. Even if you're not good enough to hit your opponents, as long as you hit something, you're still contributing to the team. One of the most frustrating parts of online shooters for me is the walk back to battle after you respawn. Splatoon's answer to this is having almost no respawn time and letting you warp to any of your allies. Add on the fact that the just one more game mum excuse doesn't matter because matches only last 3 minutes, and I dare say that Splatoon single-handedly is the most fun and relaxing multiplayer game ever made. Every aspect of Splatoon makes it enjoyable for kids whilst also being fun for adults. Not to mention robust single players for people who only enjoy campaigns like me, and there's no question that Splatoon is the best Nintendo franchise since Xenoblade. On top of all that, it's also the best stealth shooter ever made. Swimming in ink just to pop out like Jaws will never get old for me, and this is how stealth should work in a multiplayer setting. Not to mention its crazy art style and boisterous attitude that, unlike other online games, Fortnite, it doesn't come off as an insidious way to lure children to its overpriced storefront because Splatoon doesn't have microtransactions. There's not a person alive I couldn't recommend Splatoon to, and it really has no competitors, but it looks like that's about to change with Foam Stars. Let's see what predatory practices screws this one over. Next up is Undertale, and where do I even begin with this? The game where the most significant problem is that there's not enough of it. I have, and most likely never will, encounter anything quite like Undertale ever again. In equal parts wacky, heartfelt, and deadly serious, its tone is matched by its brilliant combat. But first I want to talk about what the combat is before I tie it into the style of the game. It's kind of brilliant, combining two opposing genres to make an experience that pleases both RPG and action game fans. The idea of having bullet hell sections means that normal RPG players might struggle with this, whilst action game veterans might be lost when it comes to making the best strategic decisions. It's sort of like if you had to play a minigame for it to be your turn in Final Fantasy. It's a brilliant concept on its own that's made even better by the humour. The bullets in the bullet hell reflect what type of monster you're fighting, making you remember each monster's unique attacks whenever you encounter them. And what sells itself as a cute mechanic where you can befriend everyone instead of killing them ends up making the game more and more depraved the more you ignore it. Then you begin to realise that Undertale isn't just some game, but a horrific nightmare from which even reloading cannot save you. The choice to talk it out with each monster is also surprisingly in-depth. Some of these conversations are really heartfelt, and honest to God, I resonated with some of them, and I cannot think of any other game where I can sympathise with some random level 2 enemy on a personal level. Finally, I want to talk about Shadow of the Colossus. Having a game consisting of solely boss fights is a bold choice, but also an artistic one. The game would lose its exceptional luster if I could defeat side colossi or level up, and that's not the kind of game Shadow of the Colossus is. It's a game that's designed to make you feel weak and helpless, but also like a monster. Climbing up these titans is perilous. You really feel at any moment you could be crushed beneath their massive size. The slow speed of each colossi is what helps to make these feel like a real struggle for survival, even though you're really in real danger. The game is so incredible in atmosphere, you never realize that you're playing a puzzle platformer. I've seen people try to pin down Shadow of the Colossus' genre as an action-adventure game, but it's not. It's an open-world puzzle platformer, but the presentation makes it look unrecognizable. What's even more incredible is the variety of puzzles to solve. Some task you with simply reaching the top, others want you to figure out how to grab hold of your quarry, and others want you to expose their weak point. I don't believe there's a game with a more daunting challenge than Shadow of the Colossus. You're just a regular person with no strength or powers, and you have to slay all these incredible beasts. When you stand there looking at one, it always feels undoable, but then a solution will naturally reveal itself, and the task becomes achievable as you swallow your doubt alongside your player character. It's a struggle to find more things to say about Shadow of the Colossus' gameplay, because every inch of it screams symbolism and deeper meaning, but I have to keep this strictly about the gameplay. There's nothing like Shadow of the Colossus, not only in the rest of the industry, but there's also nothing else quite like one of its individual boss fights within the game itself, and that's what makes Shadow of the Colossus have the most unique combat of all time.